Shabusta.
Good morning, everybody, or depending where you are, good afternoon, good evening. It's morning here in California.
Good morning.
Morning.
The beauty of technology. We've got people from all over the world. I love it. Just to while people are filing in, just want to introduce the team here, the DBSA team. So we've got Paul, our executive director. Say hi, Paul, runs the show, puppet master extraordinaire. We've got Jeff, the president, Jeff Fox. My name's Andrea. I'm the head of the education committee. I've got my partner in crime here, Sally, from the education committee. She's going to help me monitor the chat. I'm just going to be emceeing stuff like that. And we've got our speakers who we'll introduce in just a moment. Probably can give me the go ahead. Maybe give people one more minute to get in here.
Andrea,
Yes.
if we can, as long as we have a minute, if people are out of the country, can you shout out and tell us where you're from?
New Jersey. I mean, is that really out of the country?
Pretty much.
I'm from
No, but Colorado is. I'm in Colorado.
Texas.
California.
Texas.
Oregon.
Santa Cruz, Southern California.
Oh,
Yeah, they're coming through on the chat too. Very cool.
we're well represented.
Wonderful. Okay, then let's get started. It's nice and early. Well, again, early here, I keep forgetting. So welcome everybody to the Depression and Bipolar Support Alliance of California, to our seventh Education Day. Just a little about us. We run all kinds of support groups, all kinds of education work. Sally's going to throw all these cool links in the chat for you guys. There's information on the website about our peer support groups. We also do these education days. We run monthly facilitator trainings for participants to become facilitators. We also will be running workshops for facilitators to learn even more. So you can sign up for the mailing list, I believe, on the website. We've also got Instagram and Facebook where you can find out more about what's going on. Sally's going to throw those in the chat. A little about me. I'm a doctoral student in clinical psychology, also the chair of the education committee and a creator of the Overcoming Self-Stigma in Bipolar Disorder program. Another link that Sally's going to throw in the chat, because something that we are really passionate about at DBSA is eradicating stigma, eradicating self-stigma. And so, yeah, that's something that we're doing. So we have amazing speakers today. I'm so excited. And in the middle, we're going to have a wonderful mindfulness break so we can all sort of detox from the demands of Zoom. And of course, at the end, we'll put a link in the chat to fill out the evaluation. And if you fill out the evaluation, you will be entered in a drawing to win either an iPad, an iPhone, or a Kindle, your choice. So that's pretty cool. So we've got two topics today. We're having what we call a showdown today. So two topics that are showing down. So the first is self-medication versus self-care. The second will be unipolar depression versus the bipolar spectrum. And we have amazing speakers for each. I'm so excited. We'll hear first from a person with lived experience, and then we'll hear from a clinician on the topic. Again, then we'll have a mindfulness break. Then we'll hear from the other topic. So I'd like to introduce our first two speakers. First, our person with lived experience is Matthew Bushell. Matthew is a British Army veteran. See, I told you they were coming from all over the world. Living with bipolar disorder. He's a peer support facilitator, a mental health advocate, a trainer, a health coach, a leadership coach, and a mental health first aider. He's training to be a WRAP, which is Wellness Recovery Action Plan. He's trained to be a WRAP facilitator and a therapeutic coach. Drawing from his lived experience of long-term sustained recovery in both substance use, PTSD, and bipolar disorder, Matthew brings a unique vision to the world and dedicates his time to helping individuals and business leaders with mental health, wellness, and recovery. So Matthew, we're so excited to have you. Our clinician
Thank
for
you.
the first topic, hi, sorry, cut you off. Our clinician for the first topic is Tim Barry. He's a licensed clinical social worker. And he's an experienced psychotherapist with a diverse range of clinical experience, it really is. Tim has a particular passion for treating patients struggling with co-occurring psychiatric and addiction disorders. His clinical approach is grounded in evidence-based treatments such as cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, radically open dialectical behavioral therapy, really good stuff. He works in private practice in California, so he's licensed to treat anyone in California. Sally will throw his link in the chat. And in addition to his private practice, he is the regional director of the addictions program at the Camden Center in San Francisco. And he's a frequent lecturer on addictions recovery and crisis intervention, which is why we looped him into being here today. So with that said, I'm going to pass it over to Matthew.
Thank you, Andrea.
Yes.
Is that me then? I'm on. Okay,
That's it.
lovely.
There you go.
Yeah, well, thanks for that introduction. I mean, listen to it back. It does sound like I'm a very busy person, but I'm going to try and keep my feet on the ground and not speak too fast. So I think what I think I'll do first of all is just give you a bit of a potted timeline, just so you can see some of the features in my life, which can then help me sort of dip into some of the relationships I've had with drugs and alcohol, and also addiction, and how I've kind of moved from that place to a place now of self-care, and basically, every day is a sort of self-care day. I look after myself daily, and I'll get more into that. So first thing I want to say is that actually my relationship with drugs and alcohol started when I was very, very young. I mean, quite scarily young, actually. I was about 12 or 13 years old, and I have a daughter now who is sort of 10 and 11. So to look back and think that I actually began my relationship without drugs and alcohol at that age is quite scary. I lived in sort of a very deprived area, lots of sort of unemployment and these types of things going on. But I went to school, and I ended up going to a grammar school, and I mentioned that as well because it was a single sex school, lots of masculinity, lots of testosterone, lots of sports, rugby and things, and a huge alcohol sort of drinking culture as well among the sort of among the students and my friends. Drinking was a big part of the rugby scene. It was a big part of school. Of course, then when I went into the army as well after I left, and that also in the UK particularly, that lots and lots of alcohol going on there. It was very much a part of the culture, and I just want to sort of point to some of these things so you can kind of imagine as I talk about my relationships with these things, some of the sort of influences that I had. When I left the army, I went into IT and into sort of tech. It was a very stressful, very highly demanding job, sort of studying every single day, and I was using alcohol and drugs in various ways through those periods. So. I went to university as well, and more alcohol, more drugs. And a little later after that, I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So actually, bipolar disorder was first talked about in my life when I was about 18 years old. So I was already in the army. I went in the army when I was 17 and a half. Now, I'd had lots and lots of sort of, let's call troubles in my youth. But, I didn't know what they were. And I went into the army. My father and my grandfather and my brothers sort of in the military. So I went in to try to, I think, kind of make something of myself and sort of live up to kind of their expectations. I think looking back of it, I didn't really have a fascination with the army, but there wasn't a huge amount to do. And I remember saying at the time, if I didn't go in the army, I think, the other options I had was like prison or something. Quite a few friends were into drugs and alcohol already in a big way, sort of dealing drugs and doing lots of criminal activity. So for me, going into the army was almost like a way out. And when I was in the army, I had various struggles, and I remember seeing sort of an army psychiatrist, and lots of questions were asked. And this is when the word bipolar first started to be mentioned. I didn't understand what it was, but I remember that was when they mentioned it. And somehow I continued my life, and then 10 years later, it was actually when I resigned from my job in IT because I was incredibly stressed and I had another episode that actually I was diagnosed. Another GP that I built a relationship with, who I trusted, said, I think you should really, pay attention to this and listen. And it was when I got diagnosed that I started to look back on my past with a very different mindset. I started to sort of reflect and piece things together in a very different way than I had up to that point. And I'm still doing this today. So I've been sort of trying to be relaxed today and think a little bit about what I'm going to talk about and reflecting on it. New things come up all the time. Every time I go back to reflect, and I think I owe my ability to reflect now upon my my history to being diagnosed with bipolar disorder and being introduced to all sorts of different ways to look after myself. So on that note, let me just dive right back into, substance use versus addiction, and essentially sort of the various ways that I used substances and the different types of substances that I use. So we're talking about alcohol. I mean, that's quite a common one. It was almost, I used to think that drugs were the bad thing when I was younger, because drugs were like the illicit thing, the illegal thing. And I remember being introduced to drugs by, friends, but actually looking back, they were not friends. It was people I was just sort of knocking around with in the estates and whatever. And when I look back at it, I remember even being very lonely then. I didn't have a huge I didn't have a sense of purpose. I didn't have a sense of belonging. My family was very, very, shall we say, dysfunctional at the time. So for me, I remember my lure into drugs was initially, it was a social thing. It was about being a part of a group. And it was about, I think it was about kind of, belonging. It was almost like a rite of passage. So I started to take drugs. And I think I didn't realize at the time that there was a kind of addiction or a kind of a dependency risk to these things. I didn't realize at the time that it would actually affect, my mind and my body and my kind of my ability to learn and my ability to concentrate. But that's actually what happened. I would sometimes drink and take drugs of a nighttime and then sort of pass out. And when I woke up, I wouldn't really recognize that it was a new situation. I wouldn't really recognize that it was a different day. And I would just sort of carry on. It was almost like I was wrapped up in this kind of physical need to carry on because the hangover was too unbearable. Coming down was too difficult. So I'd carry on, and it would affect absolutely everything. It would affect whatever I was trying to do. From a mind perspective, I couldn't concentrate. I couldn't even think straight, and I couldn't feel properly either. Like my emotions were all over the shop. And I think, not just that either. I remember when I did start sort of asking for help at certain times, I became aware of painkillers, codeine, aspirin, and I remember always thinking at certain times, how could I get high, or how could I get this good feeling? So I remember in the early days really associating drugs and alcohol with a change in my physiology, the way I felt, and I guess in many ways, reflecting on this today, I think I did it to get close to people, and that is really a testament to how lonely I was and how depressed I was as a young person. And I think, the impact on my mind and my body, I think I didn't really understand until many years later. But what was quite apparent was the impact on my sort of social relationships. If I fast forward to when I was even to when I had children. So after I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I tried very hard to commit to all sorts of different wellness practices. I did the wellness recovery action planning, and I had periods of success, but I also had relapses. And one particular relapse, a story that I share a lot, was a time when I was very, very depressed, and I knew I was depressed, and yet I found myself in pubs and clubs in my hometown by myself, drinking, taking drugs, and essentially interacting with strangers. And it was a very I have mixed episodes, so I have this very that kind of typical, two faces of bipolar, that real sad and that real happy, that image really resonates with me quite a lot, because that's how I felt a lot. And I would often take drugs and drink alcohol when I was depressed rather than when I was hypermanic. And I think that is something that I've learned about myself. When I'm really, really, really happy and joyful, I can actually now quite confidently say I'm not attracted to drugs or alcohol at all. It's the other way around. It's definitely related to a form of self-medication, rather than like just something you do when you're social. It took me a long time to figure that out. But this particular time I'm talking about, I ended up getting very, very, very drunk, and I was also on Depakote, and I was also on sort of other antipsychotics at the time. And I ended up getting arrested because I got involved in a very serious assault. And it was really a rock bottom for me, because I was culpable. I was responsible for it. Sort of ex-army. I had a reasonable good reputation. I was certainly certainly considered to be a trier, somebody who was trying to sort his life out. And here I was once again. I had a young daughter at the time, and here I was again, sort of, in police custody, facing a really substantial change in my future. I mean, I was basically facing prison. And it was that day that I got told, sad to say, really, I wasn't truly motivated to change at that point. It was actually motivated by the threat of going to prison. Somebody said to me, solicitor said, if you've got to start thinking about character references, you've got to start thinking about mitigating circumstances. We know that you've had an episode, so they were starting thinking about all these different things that could help me to basically get out of this situation. And it was on that day that I decided not to drink alcohol, not to take drugs, and to commit to a rehabilitation program. So I decided to do it. But I remember at the time, telling everybody the reasons why I wanted to do it, but actually deep down it was so I could avoid prison. And I don't think it was a very real, honest sort of commitment on my part. Nonetheless, so I did go teetotal and didn't take any drugs of any kind other than the prescription drugs for bipolar disorder for 2 years, for 2 whole years. And I think it's quite interesting for me because in those 2 years, I lost almost 80% of the people who I thought were friends. And in that time, I realized I was suffering from complex post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as bipolar disorder. And really, I think that's when the healing started. I mean, to some degree, healing started when I was diagnosed, but I was never really a part of a program. I was never really sort of embraced by a system and sort of helped to heal. It was very much fits and starts and me trying to read the right books and all this kind of stuff. But when I actually started to look at this from a substance abuse and sort of addiction perspective, everything changed for me because I would piece things together in such a different way with the help of the counsellors. And one of the things I mentioned to Tim when we were talking before, as we were preparing for this, is I never used to know at what point I'd be walking in the street, sort of really, really, really depressed and really angry as well, and all these mixed emotions and really lonely and unsure what to do, and suicidal ideation, all sorts of stuff would happen, as I'm sure many people in this sort of virtual room will understand. And I would just smell alcohol, just smell it. Or I would just see a pub and I would see through the window and it would just look so romantic inside. It would look like there were people who were bonding, loving each other, getting on. And I remember the perspective I had of sort of what people were doing in these places was so different to what the reality was. But I had some kind of issue with this. So I would literally walk past and I'd be like, I've got to, I'm lonely. So I would go in and I would start to drink and I would start to do these things. And it was a really difficult habit to break because I had to, with the support of the counsellors, I had to sort of notice it and I had to really sort of be with it and the impulses, and I had to sort of work through these things. And I'm sure Tim will be able to sort of open up, kind of some of the ways that is done. But I just became really aware of the need. It was almost like a different type of self-care. Self-care wasn't sort of just drinking the right water and eating the right food back then or getting the right sleep. It was noticing when I'm about to do something which is actually not serving me very well, when it was actually about to lead me on a trend, or down a path that ultimately was going to take the control away from me. And that was a very difficult thing for me to learn how to do. And one of the things that I've really struggled with to this day is this sensation of not getting it right or not getting it wrong. I thought, right, okay, I can't drink forever, I can't take drugs forever, and that way I'll know for sure I'm getting it right. And I would take a really extreme attitude towards these things, rather than kind of learning the art of moderation, which is what we're told is a much more sensible approach to kind of these different types of behaviors. I would almost ditch one habit for another, or ditch one addiction for another. And there's different types of addictions, not just alcohol, not just substance abuse. I mean, I remember, and I struggle to say this even now, and I don't know why. It's obviously, the way that I tell myself certain stories and things, also because of the kind of, I'd get told off by my family, you couldn't mention sex when I was a child. So I actually then developed quite an addiction to pornography, which I mentioned in a talk once before, which Andrew was a part of. So I noticed that actually I was substituting things, and these addictions were becoming less out in the open and much more private and much more secret. And that was harder to ask people for help for. because it's almost like they became more shameful. You know, it was easier just to drink a load of alcohol, especially when my character was so wrapped up in, you know, he's a party animal, he's that guy, he's that guy. He's the guy who can drink 10 pints, or he's the guy that can drink the bottle of whiskey. Much more difficult to have a conversation, and I did, with my counselors and therapist about the the way that I was addicted to pornography or addicted to some other activities, and that includes exercise. I even got really addicted to exercise, and I thought I was doing brilliant at that, and then I got an injury and everything came crashing down. So I was really, when I committed to something, I was notorious for committing to it 100%, and almost then it became a negative quite quickly. So I think now it's probably a good time to sort of talk a little bit about how I began to transition into that kind of self-care. I had to notice, first of all, and then start to replace old habits with better habits that serve me better, and that can sometimes mean wasn't as destructive. And I think from me to you, I think that's a good place to start. And I think I've learned to accept that actually, caffeine's another thing, but I've learned to accept that phrase of, I think it's the less of the evil, the better, the thing that doesn't kind of cause the broad amount of sort of destruction. And I remember a psychiatrist said to me, he said, Matthew, he said, your mental illness, he said, is only as severe as the kind of disturbance and the destruction it causes in your sort of social and your sort of professional life. So if you're managing to go to work and you're managing to maintain relationships, even if you're not totally happy, even if you're still struggling, even if you're still depressed, he said, I want you to know that you're on the right path. So I do sort of use that as a general litmus test, that if my sort of house is okay and my work is okay, and generally there's no sense of destruction in these things, then actually I'm doing okay. And I think one of the things to sort of talk a little bit about is how variety has played such an important part in the way that I have developed into who I am today. I used to think of, and I say this a lot, I used to think of self-care as being, doing all the right things. So whatever other people say. So if people say, okay, go to the gym, physical activity, go to bed on time, drink and eat well, I would literally try to cram all that lot into every day. And the amount of pressure I put on myself would be unbearable. And ultimately I discovered that would often feed into this sense of failure that I sometimes had. And again, this sense of shame for not being able to succeed. So I learned just to sort of focus on small things, like one thing at a time. So sort of push a lot of things out of the picture, and perhaps I'll be like, okay, for the next couple of weeks, I'm gonna let everything roll, but I'm just gonna try and work on getting to bed on at a good time, so 9:30, 10 o'clock, so that I've actually got enough energy tomorrow to think more deeply about what I can do next. And I would just do that over and over and over until I had some stability in one area of my life. So I think my message to you is think about just focusing on something very, very small that can actually be achievable, and then celebrate when you actually succeed, and understand that success looks different from one person to another. So try and get used to what is good for you, and give yourself a pat on the back when that happens. Don't try and be perfect. Just kind of try and progress to some degree, try and find some kind of incremental improvements. And also, one of the other things that I've already pointed to is my relationship with therapy. I tried all sorts of different types of therapies because sometimes things didn't feel like they worked, and now I now realize it might be down to a particular individual. Maybe I wasn't getting on with that individual, or was it the type of therapy? So that kind of sense of courage, that sense of courageousness and trying different things and having that kind of diversity really served me quite well. So I tried art therapy, I tried sort of CBT, dialectical behavioral therapy. I mean, lots of things I'm sure Tim can sort of go into, but I tried lots of different things until I found out what worked for me. And I also did creative writing and journal therapy, and I found that to be very, very effective. Sort of writing to myself, sort of writing to myself when I was in these different states. So writing to the guy who was about to walk into a pub, writing to the guy who thought maybe he could get away with going to see a prostitute. And I hate saying these things because obviously I've still got a degree of stigma associated to this, but I found through journaling and actually writing to myself enabled me to essentially stop denying that it was happening. And that's also where peer support actually really served a huge purpose, because I was less embarrassed to talk to other people in peer support settings who were already talking about things which I was experiencing. So I sort of heard it from others and was like, yeah, I have that, that happens to me too. So peer support became a real huge part of my life. I think I went to my first peer support group probably in, 2013, and I still go to the same peer support group locally today. So it's like a good 10 years, and it's every Thursday each month, and I still go, and I've built some incredible relationships, and it's amazing to just to have kind of become who I am, with other people witnessing who actually understand how sometimes it's difficult to even explain this stuff, and difficult to understand how you can self-sabotage, because the one thing about addiction or substance abuse that I've recognized is, well, sometimes it was to be close to people, other times it was actively to harm myself. It was a kind of form of self-harm, because I was suffering, because I felt pain, and ultimately sometimes that got very, very serious in the sense of, and I think maybe Tim can talk about this a little bit in terms of how self-destructive some of these behaviors can be. They're not just self-medication. I think sometimes there's this idea that you take something to make you feel better. Actually, sometimes I drank so much alcohol and took so much drugs. I had one aim, and that was ultimately to try to not wake up again. And I think so there's a very destructive side to these, this idea of self-medication. Whereas the opposite of that is self-care, where I do everything in my day nowadays. Every single day, I do everything I can to foster this sense of hope, to this sense of tomorrow's going to be, it's just full of opportunity. I don't think too far ahead. I don't strategize too far ahead. I've hardly done any preparation for this, because as soon as I go into my brain, essentially I start to get anxious. I've had to do some meditation and stuff, so I welcome the break with the medication. So I don't know how I'm doing for time, Andrea, but I can talk forever, you know that. But I feel like I've sort of shared quite a few things in there, and would encourage people to take time to understand themselves from the perspective of their relationships with some of the substances, whether they're prescribed or not, whether they're over the counter, whether it's marijuana and weed and things, and cocaine. So much of these things were acceptable in certain social situations, even though they were illegal. So the fact that they were illegal kind of always at the back of my mind, I knew I was doing something that potentially had a risk. But the real scary one was, I never once thought alcohol was so damaging to me. I never thought that. And actually the thing that I have to watch out for, even to this day, more than anything else, is alcohol. Because as soon as I taste a single glass of white wine or something, I immediately access this kind of sense of euphoria in my mind. I can immediately feel it. And it's very similar to hypomania, when I was these moments I can remember dancing around in the snow with music in my ears. I think it was Johnny Cash at the time, and I felt totally in love with the world. And I can associate that feeling with the moment I sort of take a sip of alcohol and the more I drink. So it's very, I'm very aware of that. And I would encourage people to, if they need to do something to really take control of their sort of wellness and take control of their recovery, and they're concerned about sort of their relationship with substances and addiction, I think the first thing to do is just to slow down and just to reflect, and just get some support from somebody, just to sort of say, well, let's ask some healthy questions about these things. How do these addictions serve us? Do they cause me any challenges? If I'm really honest with myself, do they affect my ability to communicate with my partner, or my ability to go to school or university or college? Because the one thing I was always in denial about, I was always in denial that these things were causing as much of a problem as they were, and everybody told me that they were causing a problem, and I was so unable to accept that. I was so unable to accept that these things weren't serving me well. And once I went through the pain and the trauma, because it was very, very traumatic, looking back into my past and trying to create some of these connections with the reasons why I was doing what I was doing. And that was very scary. I mean, one of the revelations was I discovered during this 2-year period of sort of rehabilitation, I discovered that I was abandoned when I was 1 year old, and I basically lived with people who I didn't know, strangers. So this sense of loneliness and this sense of being by myself, ultimately, it's real. It comes from somewhere. It's not just a figment of my imagination. It's something I've learned, and to then be compassionate towards myself, to sort of embrace myself in a way, and give myself that kind of self-love. Even now I can feel it. To learn to do it for yourself when others are not able to do it in the way that you need is a tough road. It's a tough road to walk. And I think, now that I've done that, no matter where I am, and I'm not saying that things don't affect me, they do, but no matter where I am, I'm always able to close my eyes, take some deep breaths, and sort of say, Matthew, you're a good guy. You're on the right path. You're trying. You care about people. This is who you are. And that power, that strength of voice, whenever I'm really, really beat, and I kid you not, only last night, something was happening in my family, and only last night I was thinking to myself, do I want a glass of wine? And I thought to myself, and it's doing things like this that really help, because I was thinking to myself, well, what is that? Why would I be drinking in that scenario? Well, actually, self-medication, 100% self-medication. I absolutely knew that I'd be drinking that wine to ease the pressure up on myself, because I was really upset about something that had happened. Upset. And I actively said, no, I'm not going to do it, because I know that today I would have felt even more sort of awkward and confused. And, why did I make that decision? I'm going on this talk, I'm talking about it, I'm an advocate, I'm committed to wellness. But I want you to know that only last night, I was still having that kind of inner conflict. So I think, Andrea, when you've sort of pitched this as a bit of a battle, it couldn't be. I often don't like to see things as a battle. It's this or that, because that's very bipolar. I mean, that's very. I try to exist in the middle space. Okay, self-medication, self-care. I mean, these things can be friends. Well, but there is a battle going on at times. If you're dealing with things that I deal with, there is a battle going on. It can be far closer than it might appear. It feels as if I'm talking about a 10 year ago sort of story, but it still features to this very day. And it will still feature when I leave here, because when I go home, it's Saturday night, my wife will probably be sitting there with a glass of wine. She'll be watching a film or something, and I'll have to just very gently sort of inquire into myself, is this okay? Am I okay? And sort of have these kind of conversations. Thankfully, my wife is completely sort of aware of sort of my journey, and I'm very, very open with her. So she'll say, "Are you okay?" And she'll encourage me to not do it. She's not sort of encouraging me to do it. Whereas some people in my social circles, they're not as shall we say, considerate, because they're not as aware of the inner struggles. So they might be like, "Oh, go on, have it. It won't harm you." The rest of it, and I've had to build up such a self-discipline, such a kind of toolkit, if you like, and that's only been possible through the therapeutic support that I've had from other people, professionals like Tim. So, Andrea, is that an appropriate segue, would you say?
That's beautiful. You are a beautiful human. Thank you for that story. And I forgot to mention, and people can put their questions in the chat and we will go over them at the end. I forgot to say that, but including hearing more about how Matthew does his self-care, because he is kind of a self-care champion, not going to lie. But thank you so much for that. Round of applause. You can't hear everybody else. I'm going to clap for everybody else. And I'm going to pass it over to Tim. See if I can do that. Hi, Tim.
Hi, how's it going? Well, thank you so much, Matthew,